Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us. We've got folks from Texas, Nebraska, Pennsylvania. I'm in California. Keith, you're on mute. Are you talking? Okay. Connecticut, Germany. All right, international. That's wonderful. Atlanta, Indiana, Los Angeles. All right. We want to honor everyone's time. I see someone from Tampa, Florida. Hi, Kirsten. Very nice to see you here. It's wonderful to have our partners join us. We are going to get started because we want to honor your time. I'm going to turn it over to Keith Bostic, our esteemed president. You are on mute. Are you not able? You're trying to get off of mute and you're not able to because everyone is muted. Okay, try it again. All right, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's gathering, where we will talk a little bit about an awesome tool that the Black Administrators in Child Welfare has for agencies, organizations, jurisdictions engaged in child welfare, engaged in human services, engaged with improving outcomes for children, families, and communities. I'm Keith Bostic, and I am the president of the Black Administrators in Child Welfare. And we're once again just so excited that you took time out of your schedule to be with us. We thought it very appropriate that we have this conversation and offer this chat during Black History Month. It doesn't mean we only need to have this conversation around Black History Month, but that we thought that it could be a pivotal, hopefully catalyst for jurisdictions, agencies, organizations to begin having those conversations about improving outcomes for African-American children in the child welfare systems and the human service systems and in other systems that are impacting and having disparate outcomes for our children, families, and communities. Once again, Keith Bostic, and I'm the president of Black Administrators in Child Welfare. And joining me today on this conversation will be Mr. Aronde Miller. And when Mr. Miller comes on, he'll share a little bit about himself. And then also you heard the voice of Ms. Yakisi Mitchell, who also will be engaged in this dialogue. During the course of our conversations, we encourage you to stroll over to the chat sections and enter questions. We'll be monitoring those questions, and at the end, we will hope to be able to respond to as many of those questions as possible, but also we'll have follow-up opportunities for engaging with BACW as well as with the race equity strategy areas. And so you might ask, who is BACW? Well, let me tell you a little bit about BACW. BACW was formed in 1971 by 13 African-American child welfare administrators. And let me tell you a little bit about the significance about that 1971. If you all can reflect back to those particular times, we were just in the midst of issues around AFDC and the greater surveillance of families in urban settings where there was lots of disenfranchisement, and this country was also just in the midst of trying to get its footing around civil rights and the aftermath of that coming out of the Vietnam War as well. So a lot of issues going on that impacted families across this country. But it was also a significant time where, Black and brown, specifically Black families, were having significant challenges in overcoming many obstacles and barriers that would lead to any kind of success or wellness in their particular families and in their particular communities. So these 13 members, can you go back to that last slide? These 13 members who were also engaged with the Child Welfare League of America. It was at an annual meeting of the Child Welfare League where a lot of conversations were being had and discussed about the plight of children across this country. But very little was being said about Black children. And so it was a group of individuals who actually approached the stage at that annual meeting and almost commandeered the mic and said, at what point in time will we talk about Black children? And so that was the impetus, that boldness, that courageousness, that was the impetus for steering a conversation and getting some intentionality with the Child Welfare League of America to begin to look at the issues impacting African-American children because of the significant disproportionate numbers. And so the Black Administrators in Child Welfare is an advocacy, membership, and research and training and technical assistance organization. We are located in Bethesda, Maryland, our corporate and headquarters office. But we're here to respond to the needs of culturally appropriate services of the overrepresented African-American children and families, and to provide a support network to agencies, organizations, and providers, and advocates, executives, systems responsible for managing child welfare systems, responsible for managing human service agencies. And so we are here to respond in a specific way to the needs of African-American children and helping those systems improve outcomes. We're now at this place in this space where BACW's role is to be a great thought and practice partner when we talk about transforming those systems, because we have been unapologetic in our efforts in saying that if you solve the issues of African-American children, you solve the issues of all children. Fully focused on the fact that African-American children are most disproportionately represented. Our mission is to have a positive impact on the lives of African-American children and families through advocacy. Several of you on this particular webinar represent advocacy groups, you represent research entities, you represent child welfare jurisdictions, you represent prevention organizations, you represent lived expertise. And so our mission is to do as much as we possibly can to keep at the forefront, to commit our passion and disseminate as much information and support as possible to develop practices and policies that and leadership that continue to move the needle of change for African-American children, which in turn will impact and significantly impact the issues of all children, families across this country. And so one such tool that we'll be talking about today is, like I said, the race equity strategy areas. And we'll go a little bit more into detail about the race equity strategy areas. We'll break those down for you. But we want to level set a little bit and talk about how we got to this place and why is it so important that these strategies be looked at or be assessed by these organizations, these agencies, through advocacy and through policy and practice. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Brother Aronde Miller. And Brother Miller, please address the audience, and we're glad to have you here.
All right. Thank you, Keith. And thank you, Yakisiwe. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. I recognize some of the folks, and so it's, I say family in some ways in terms of, some familiar folks, but I also say family in a larger sense because all of us are on this call and engaged in this work because we're trying to get to a different kind of transformation in all these systems that touch the lives of children and families. And so thank you all once again. To get us started, one of the first things we like to do is share how we think about this work of enhancing the well-being of Black children and youth and creating the conditions ultimately that help Black families to be healthy and to thrive. And so to begin, we always want to acknowledge the rich cultural tradition that has long anchored the Black family presence and ways of being. So Dr. Hill, as early as 1972, 1973, in his book, Strengths of Black Families, highlights some of the features that have allowed the Black family to persevere in this country. And so they include strong achievement orientation, strong work orientation, flexible family roles, strong kinship bonds, as well as strong religious orientation. And many of you all have probably been sort of exposed to some of Dr. Hill's work. And as well, numerous other scholars highlight similar and complementary features of the Black family tradition. So these scholars include Dr. Joyce Ladner, I'd say Doctors Elmer Martin and Joanne Mitchell Martin, among others. And so we're also clear that living in such a highly racialized society, such as the United States, and particularly experiencing the brute force of racism and discrimination throughout our history in this country, has both taken a toll on Black families and continues to impact the daily life experiences of Black children, Black youth, and adults. And so this is felt most sharply in our daily contact with the major institutions and systems that form our society. So this graphic here illustrates at least a few of these systems and structures. So you can see on the screen, you can see education, banking, criminal justice, and then also public health. And so public health in this instance is in some ways like a catch-all for all the other systems and sort of factors that organize our society and thus shape our daily lives. And so these systems and factors would include employment, neighborhood and physical environment, which would include like playgrounds and sort of common spaces, food and food access, community safety, healthcare, housing, transportation, you name it, but the host of systems that shape our society and that shape the lives of people every single day. And so when you look at Black families associated with all of these institutions and life factors in our society, we continue to see persistently Black families experiencing some of the worst outcomes, and with research documenting the historic and present day implications of racism and community disinvestment as a significant contributor. And so if you also look at these different systems, part of what we try to emphasize is that these are all interrelated. You're not just involved with one of these systems as you live and sort of move through life on a day-to-day basis, but you're involved with all these different systems and structures. And so the kinds of disparities and the kinds of sort of, in some cases, discrimination, in some cases it's bias, in some cases it's sort of the built-in sort of ways that these institutions work. What happens in our experiences in some of these institutions, they interrelate with the kinds, or they inform the kinds of experiences that we have with some of the other institutions. And so these sort of structural dynamics are at the core of how we think about and approach this work. And so, as I've sort of suggested, this has informed our early and our continuing thinking about how to best support the transformation of all the systems that shape Black life in this country, and especially those systems that tend to be most punitive in responding to Black families in need, and also that hold great potential for positively supporting and improving the well-being of Black children and families. So this is why BACW has an explicit anti-racism focus in our work. Can we go to the next slide? Now, I want to dive in a little bit more on this next slide, which is really sort of a further examination, or maybe just highlighting what was at the center of this sort of anti-racism focus slide. And so it really is highlighting these different levels of racism in our society that operate within our society. And so you have internalized racism, you have interpersonal racism, you have institutional racism, and systemic racism. And so I was talking about the next slide, but you can see them sort of there at the center of this slide. And it's likely clear to many of you, there are different strategies that are most helpful at rooting out racism at these various levels or in these various expressions. And so the kinds of work that you would do to get at and to root out internalized racism, it would be some of the sort of self-internalized sort of learning, thinking about and reflecting on how, sort of messages that are sort of offered in mass media, how they're projected, how we've internalized them, how we made sense of them, and sometimes how we live our lives sort of in response to them. In the same way, interpersonal racism, how we engage and interact with one another, that's work that we wouldn't be doing ourselves, but we will be doing that in relationship to other people. And so I'll sort of move on. Institutional and systemic racism, that's especially where we like to focus our work. And so as we develop the racial equity strategy areas, we're most focused on the dynamics that most professionals and administrators working within these systems have the most control over on a day-to-day basis. And that's the policies and practices that influence how you support children and families on a day-to-day basis. We would argue that the internalized work is important. We would argue that the interpersonal work is important. And sometimes that plays into the work, sort of trying to achieve racial equity within these systems. But specifically, the institutional policies and practices are what people working, and especially administrators working in these systems, have much more control over on a day-to-day basis. And so this is where we focus our work, and particularly through the racial equity strategy areas. And so I'll pause here, and then I'll hand it over to Yakisiwe and Keith, who will continue to talk a little bit more about the landscape, and then more specific details about the racial equity strategy areas and opportunities to be involved in that work. Yakisiwe?
So I'm on, and you can see that I'm having trouble. I'm frozen, so I'm trying to make an adjustment.